The Democratic Alliance's letter to some Western countries has caused a stir in some quarters. Now, the Independent Electoral Commission has described the DA's decision to write a letter to the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, as well as other foreign ministers, as unconventional. Now, DA Shadow International Relations Minister Louise Powell joins us now for a discussion. Emma, thank you so much for your time this evening. And before we even get to what the IEC had to say, I'm keen to hear from you very briefly. What was the thinking behind writing this letter?
Evening, thanks for having me. So in February this year, the multi-party charter, that's 11 political parties, wrote to the G7 and the European Union, stipulating that we needed all eyes on this election and detailing a number of requests. The letter that the Democratic Alliance sent to 13 nations, as well as 2 regional blocs, the EU and the AU, on Friday, was essentially reiterating the multi-party charter request, and essentially we're asking that the international community provide resources for the additional deployment of domestic observers, international monitors, to equip civil society organizations to provide voter education, resources for a PVT system, which we can talk about. And then, of course, importantly, we're asking for resources that will protect South Africa against any attempts by foreign actors to manipulate the election outcome using artificial intelligence, cyber hacks, and the likes.
But before we move on from that, who are these foreign players that you're concerned about?
Well, we've seen in numerous elections throughout the world, including elections that have happened in the United States, that there has been foreign interest in certain election outcomes. We've seen, for example, the string of 8 coups d'etats that have happened in West Africa, that there have been undemocratic foreign actors who have played a role in at certain levels in regards to that destabilization. And so we just need to make sure that undemocratic countries that do not share our vision for a stable, peaceful South Africa are not able to, via nefarious forces or political parties themselves, gain a foothold amongst the South African electorate.
So you think there could be a coup in South Africa, if I'm hearing you correctly? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely not. That's 100% not what I'm saying. My words were to protect against foreign interference in respect of cyber hacks, coordinated mis- and disinformation campaigns, and the use of artificial intelligence and things like deep fakes. We already saw deep fakes coming out of a new political party onto the scene yesterday, where Donald Trump's voice was manipulated to essentially instruct the South African electorate to vote for a certain party. This content was pushed out via X. It's this sort of coordinated mis- and disinformation campaign that we need to guard against.
What I'm referring to are the 8 countries that you've just cited around the continent where there's been instability when it comes to their governance. So that's what I was referring to what you just said about that particular concern on the coups. But in the interest of time, let's then move on. Did you write this letter because you do not have confidence in the IEC processes?
Absolutely not. And I've done so many interviews over the past few days, because the inference that's been deliberately drawn here is that the DA is essentially saying that we don't have confidence in the IEC. We have full confidence at a structural level in the Independent Electoral Commission. But it is common practice throughout democracies in the world that international communities send election observers. The ANC themselves deploy election monitors and observers to other countries. Thabo Mbeki himself presided as an independent election monitor in the Côte d'Ivoire. We send observers to Zimbabwe. This is standard practice for international countries to deploy observers. What we would like is additional independent domestic observers, because given the stakes of this election being what they are, where we know that there is a possibility that the ANC may lose their 50% threshold, as well as the entrance onto the political scene of new political parties that don't support South Africa's constitutional values and that have been active in creating destabilization in provinces like KwaZulu-Natal. We know that the stakes are high, so we want additional independent monitors at every voting station across the country, and that's not something that any single individual party can do.
All right, I'm going to, there's a few things that you've just mentioned that I'd like to follow up on, but the inference has been drawn, and at least from where I was reading this entire situation and the letter, right, as a journalist, and I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this one, is the fact that if you are so trusting of the structural processes in the IEC, why did you not ask for a meeting with the IEC to try and outline some of these issues before writing then to these particular bodies that you're now calling for assistance from?
So we did. Our election representative, who's also a member of parliament, he's a very senior member of our federal executive, along with another colleague in parliament, wrote to the IEC commissioner. They travelled up to Johannesburg 2 weeks ago. They had a meeting at the IEC's offices in Johannesburg. They asked about the request on additional international monitors. They were told that the matter essentially lay with DIRCO, and that a decision had been made that no additional contingents would be allowed. In that meeting, it was also raised that we were very concerned that the spending patterns of the ANC in terms of, for example, their manifesto launch, a number of other big ticket items, hadn't been disclosed to the IEC in terms of the Party Political Financing Act. And then, of course, that the ANC were making their declarations for the last quarter under the smokescreen of what we know as their business arm, Chancellor House. They were essentially using Chancellor House as a front to hide who was actually funding them. So all of these concerns were raised with the IEC 2 weeks ago, and the IEC essentially said that these were matters that were out of their control. So these matters were raised with the IEC before we sent the letter. All
right. So then I'm going to get to what you've said about, the former President Thabo Mbeki in just a moment. But the U.S., through its mission spokesperson, David Feldman, at the U.S. Embassy has said that, and I'm quoting, South Africa is a sovereign democracy that runs its own electoral processes. The IEC has a long-standing and excellent reputation for conducting free and fair elections. It sounds like you might not get your way.
Well, I'm not prepared to discuss at this point in time any discussions that we've had with any individual embassies.
But this is this is a response from the U.S. Embassy. We solicited it. We asked for the response. Now, this is what they're saying. So I'm asking for your reaction to this, not individual embassies, but to the statement.
So we absolutely would agree and share the sentiments of that spokesperson. As I've said on record now, over the past 2 days, we have faith at a structural national level in the IEC running a free and fair election. But here's the thing. There are almost 24,000, so it's 23,500 voting stations across South Africa, many of them in very rural parts of this country. No individual political party has the ability to deploy a party agent and an election monitor to each of these stations. We, as a vibrant democracy, have got a well-resourced and very well-functioning network of civil society organizations that do deploy domestic observers. But these organizations need resources, they need support, they need help. And so we are, in the interests of democracy, wanting to reach out to the international community, firstly, number one, from a strategic perspective, to ensure that all eyes are on this election because of the stakes. And number two, that any available resources are directed not to us as a party. We haven't asked that these resources are given to us, that these resources are directed into the deployment by civil society organizations and independent watchdogs. Now, any person, any political party who is invested in a free and fair election would support the deployment of additional observers, because we know that at the granular level, at individual voting stations, and we saw it with the 2021 election, it's not a structural objective that there's some kind of embedded corruption. Human error occurs when people are tired counting votes late at night. In 2021, in the city of Cape Town, we as the Democratic Alliance, and there were a couple of other parties, lodged recounts. Those recounts resulted in the DA losing certain seats in the city of Cape Town Council and other parties gaining seats. In my constituency, I asked for a recount, one of my VDs. I had 1,000 extra votes that were attributed. It's human error. This is why we need election monitors on the ground.
So wait, Emma, with that particular case, are you saying that you were raising the issue and you were concerned because you lost when you asked for a recount?
Sorry, no, in my constituency, we gained votes when we asked for a recount. Those votes on the results slip that was sent to the headquarters, the DA's votes had incorrectly been written down on the columns underneath a different party name, a party that we'd never heard of. We asked for a recount. It turned out that there was human error, that the presiding officer had in error written down the DA's number under a different party. We asked for a recount and those votes were attributed to the DA.
So one then, pardon me, Emma, pardon me for coming in there. One then can say, if you were able to raise a concern and then there was a recount and then you were able to get your votes, then the system is working.
Absolutely, where we have party agents and we have boots on the ground and we have people observing. The only reason that as the constituency head I was able to pick that anomaly up was because I had a party observer at the voting station who at 3 o'clock in the morning was able to send me the slip. I was running my war room and I looked at the slip and I said, hold on, this political party's never canvassed or campaigned in this area. How was it that they got 1,000 votes? We need a recount here. The IEC obliged immediately. They set up dates for recounts to happen across Cape Town where these disputes had been lodged. They recounted. It was run freely and fairly. The IEC is a very competent organization, but human error happens. Now, 23,500 VDs across South Africa, rural Limpopo, rural Mpumalanga, rural KZN. If parties can't deploy agents to those voting stations, either individuals who've got nefarious intentions or human error can indeed result in errors that aggregated to the provincial and the national level can have serious implications. So that's the thing. Resources must be directed. And this happens, I have to say, I know that there's a deliberate push behind this outrage and it's elections.
So wait, where does it come from? Where does this deliberate push come from?
Well, it's election season,
but
so
where does it? One can accuse you.
Be used to beat any political parties, but they're going to be used.
But the same, Emma, pardon me, before you continue, the same can be said for the Democratic Alliance, because I'm listening to what you're saying right now. You're outlining the processes, and it sounds to me like if you raise a concern, the concern gets corrected, and then you are able to put the matter to bed. And you say that you do have, confidence in the IEC and its processes, and this is by no means undermining the processes of the IEC. Then one would ask the question again, why did you then believe that you need to write this letter? Because when one is listening, one could also accuse you as the Democratic Alliance of electioneering.
So I think that I've answered your question now twice.
No, but I mean in terms of the electioneering comment, you're saying that there's a big push by some political parties who are reacting because this is election season. You could also be accused of also being trying to play into the elections gallery by this, because you think about some of the columns that have been written post this letter. Mpumelelo Mkhabela, for example, calls it bizarre, even goes as far as saying, how do you write to a country like the United States, for example, when it had its own insurrection on the 6th of January 2021? You then also look at the fact that former President Thabo Mbeki, for example, you've cited him, but when he goes to these particular missions, he goes as part of the AU or the SADC or the Commonwealth mission. So one could also say that as you're accusing others of electioneering, you could be accused of it the same.
Well, everybody is free to make their own intellectual reservations. The fact remains that we need all eyes on this election, and that it's for that reason that the Democratic Alliance wrote to these 13 nations and 2 regional blocs requesting resources and assistance directed into independent civil society organizations and watchdogs. There is no single political party in this country that has the ability to have an observer at every single station. We therefore rely on civil society. Civil society needs resources in order to do its job. The deployment of additional independent, international and domestic monitors, whether they're international or domestic monitors, it shores up support and confidence in the election outcome, and it benefits everybody. It doesn't just benefit the DA. We're not asking for these resources to deploy to, for example, DA strongholds. We're not involved in that at all. We're saying, please, if you as a nation have got resources, you want to help shore up democratic processes in South Africa, these are the 4 things that you can do for our nation, not for the DA, for our nation. So if you want to accuse us of politicking, then as I say, it is election season. You know, people are going to have their own intellectual reservations or thoughts. People are going to be angry. We didn't just write to the United States, even though the United States letter is doing the rounds because of the very strategic geopolitical position that they occupy. And then, of course, you know, that paralleled with the ANC's current dalliance with certain other actors like Russia. So there's this deliberate pitting of certain nations against one another to deflect from what the actual ask is. And the actual ask is, please, if you have resources, send them to civil society so that we can make sure we've got boots on the ground.
So then there will be, of course, when you think about each election, the embassies also sent their accredited, representatives, the AU as well, and we're going to be seeing quite a number of missions. You don't think that these missions can do a good job?
They'll do a good job, but there are not enough of them. So that was the problem, is that there were only, the feedback that we received from the seniors that we spoke to was that there would only be allowed about 120, so 2 from specific nations that were invited. So in the absence of permissions being granted by DIRCO or by whoever the grants the authority, apparently it's DIRCO, although DIRCO spokesperson says it's the IEC, so they keep passing the ball to one another. But in the absence of additional contingents from embassies being allowed to come to South Africa, we're then saying, cool, we can't change government's decision, but what we can do is we can make sure that there is capacity building for domestic independent monitors. And as you very well know, we've got a very vibrant civil society network in South Africa, and they can fill in those gaps.
So just before I let you go, because we're out of time, but there's a comment I'm sure you've seen, and you're very fitting to answer this question, that has also drawn the much criticism, whether it be on social media or various platforms, were the comments by your leader, Mr. Steenhuisen, saying one man's genocide could be another man's freedom.
I'm so glad that you raised that. This is exactly why in item 4 on my letter, we asked that technology is directed to independent watchdogs to help protect South Africans from sinister attempts to manipulate election outcomes through the use of artificial intelligence, cyber hacks, and coordinated mis- and disinformation campaign. Yesterday, the DA took that logo and put a red stamp with a cross through it saying fake news. This is exactly the kind of fake news that takes hold on WhatsApp groups throughout South Africa and is circulated. So when someone can actually direct me to a physical video of our leader saying that, we'll welcome it. Until such time as I see that, consider it as fake news.
All right, Emma, so much to talk about, so little time. We out of time, but there's quite a lot, especially when it comes to some of the issues around the letter, the MK party, this particular video. But let's leave it there for now. That's DA Shadow International Relations Minister Emma Louise Powell.